Ronan slipped from his father's hand and ran straight into the crowd before anyone could stop him. The market was loud that morning, full of shouting vendors and clattering carts, and for one heartbeat Draven Ashwood lost sight of his son completely. His chest tightened in a way it never did on the battlefield. A crowd like this could swallow a small child in seconds. He pushed forward, calling the boy's name, and two of his guards broke into a run beside him, scattering baskets of apples and bolts of cloth in their hurry. Then he saw him. Ronan had stopped at a flower stall at the edge of the square, and he was not crying, not lost, not afraid. He was standing perfectly still, staring up at a young woman kneeling among buckets of white lilies, and before Draven could reach them, his son threw both arms around her legs and looked up into her face with an expression of complete certainty. "Mama," Ronan said. The word was small, but it landed like a stone dropped into still water. Every guard behind Draven stopped walking. A vendor nearby, mid-sentence about the price of bread, simply closed his mouth. Even the pigeons pecking at scattered grain seemed to pause. Draven felt something shift low in his chest, an old and unfamiliar pull, the kind he had not felt since before his wife died giving birth to the boy now clinging to a stranger's skirt. The young woman blinked down at the child, clearly startled, her hands still full of lily stems. She was perhaps 24, with warm brown hair pulled back loosely, and kind eyes that now widened in confusion. "Oh, hello there," she said gently, crouching so she was closer to his height without breaking his grip. "I think you might be looking for someone else, sweetheart." Ronan did not let go. If anything, he held tighter, pressing his face briefly against her sleeve before looking up again. "You smell like home," he said, as if that settled the matter entirely. The woman laughed softly, a little embarrassed, glancing past him toward the men, now gathering only a few steps away. Her laughter faded when she saw their faces. These were not ordinary market-goers. The men were tall, still, and watching her with an intensity that made the hair on her arms rise, though she could not have said why. She did not know that wolves could sense truth long before their minds caught up to it, or that the child's small nose had recognized something the grown wolves around him were only beginning to feel. Draven reached them at last, breathing evenly again, though his eyes had not left the woman since he'd heard his son speak that single word. He placed a steady hand on Ronan's shoulder, more from habit than any real intention of pulling him away. "I'm sorry," Draven said, his voice low and careful. "He doesn't usually do this." "It's all right," she said, straightening slightly, though Ronan's arms remained locked around her. "Children get attached to strangers sometimes. I used to do the same thing when I was small, apparently. I'd hug anyone who smiled at me." She meant it as something light, something to ease the strange tension crackling in the air, but Draven only studied her more closely. There was nothing unusual about her by human standards. She wore a plain green dress dusted with pollen, and her basket held little more than cut flowers and a folded cloth. And yet his own wolf, silent for 3 long years, had lifted its head the moment he'd smelled her on the breeze. "What's your name?" he asked, before he could stop himself. "Ilara," she said, glancing between him and the boy still holding on to her. "And you are?" "Draven." He hesitated, unused to introducing himself without a title attached. "This is Ronan, my son. He has excellent taste in mothers, apparently," Ilara said, trying for humor again, though something about the way the men around her stood so rigidly made her wonder if she'd said something wrong. She glanced down at Ronan and gently touched his hair. "I'm not your mama, little one, but I think you're very sweet." Ronan tilted his head, unconvinced, the way only a very young child can be unconvinced by an adult's certainty. "You are," he said simply, and buried his face against her again. An awkward silence stretched between the adults, broken only by the noise of the market continuing around them, indifferent to the quiet drama unfolding at the flower stall. One of the guards, a broad-shouldered man named Gideon, exchanged a look with the other guard, Callum, and neither of them said a word, though their expressions carried the weight of something neither dared speak aloud in front of a stranger. Draven crouched down to his son's level, ignoring the ache in his knees from years of training and old wounds. "Ronan," he said gently, "why did you call her that?" The boy considered the question with the serious concentration only small children seem capable of. He looked at Ilara, then back at his father. "She smells like the blanket," he said. "The one Mama made. The one that got put away." Draven's breath caught. There was a blanket, folded and tucked away in a chest at the back of his room, one of the last things his late wife had stitched before she died. He had never let Ronan near it, not because he meant to hide it, but because looking at it still hurt in ways he rarely allowed himself to feel. He had not realized the boy even remembered its scent. Ilara, watching the exchange, felt a strange tightening in her own chest, though she could not explain it. She had lost her own parents years ago, in a fire that had taken the small house she grew up in, and she had built her quiet life alone ever since, tending flowers because they asked nothing of her, and gave everything back in color and scent. She had no family of her own, no children, no one waiting for her at the end of the day, and yet something about this small boy's grip on her sleeve, something about the steady, searching way his father looked at her, made her feel, for one absurd moment, as though she had wandered into the middle of someone else's homecoming. "I should probably explain," Draven said finally, straightening, though his eyes remained on her. "There are things about my family that are not simple to explain in the middle of a market." Alara raised an eyebrow, glancing at Ronan, who had finally loosened his grip enough to look up at her with a small, hopeful smile, the kind that could undo far more guarded hearts than hers. "That sounds like the beginning of a very strange sentence," she said carefully. "Are you going to tell me you're royalty in disguise or something?" Draven's mouth twitched. The closest thing to a smile he'd managed in longer than he could remember. "Something like that," he admitted. "Would you be willing to hear more, somewhere quieter than this?" Alara hesitated. She had lived long enough near the border of the old estate lands to have heard whispers about the Ashwood family, stories of a reclusive household on the hill, of strange strength and stranger loyalty among the men who worked their land, of a grief that had settled over the house since the young lady of the estate passed away 3 years before. She had never given the stories much thought. Rumors were common in small towns, stitched together from boredom and half-truths. But there was something in Draven's eyes that did not match rumor. There was something raw and careful there, the look of a man who had learned not to hope for things, and was now, against his will, hoping anyway. "I have flowers to sell," she said slowly, glancing at her half-empty basket, "but I suppose I could spare an hour, if your son promises to let go of my dress eventually." Ronan, as if sensing victory, grinned and finally released her skirt, though he immediately reached up to take her hand instead. She looked down at their joined hands, startled by how natural it felt, how easily his small fingers curled around hers, as though they had done this 100 times before. Draven watched the exchange with an expression none of his guards had seen on him in years, something unguarded, something almost afraid of its own hope. He gestured for Gideon to gather the last of her flowers and pay whatever coin was needed to settle her stall for the day, waving off her protest with a quiet, "Please, allow me." As they walked together through the thinning crowd, Alara flanked by a small boy who refused to release her hand and trailed by silent, watchful guards. She felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes following them. Merchants paused mid-sale. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts. Word would travel through the town before nightfall, she knew, twisted and embellished with every retelling, but in that moment, she found she did not care. There was something steadying about the boy's grip on her hand, something that felt less like a stranger's attachment, and more like recognition, though recognition of what, she could not yet say. She did not know, as they left the market behind and began the long walk toward the hill where the Ashwood estate stood half-hidden among old oak trees, that she was walking toward a truth far stranger than any rumor the townsfolk had ever whispered. She did not know about pacts, or bonds, or the ancient belief that a child's instinct could sense what even grown wolves took years to understand. All she knew was that a small hand held hers with absolute trust, and that the tall, quiet man walking beside her kept glancing at her as though she were something precious he was afraid to look away from, lest she vanish like morning mist over the hills. The estate gates came into view sooner than she expected, tall iron shapes twisted into patterns of leaves and wolves, and beyond them a house that seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the day would bring. Alara paused at the threshold, suddenly aware of how far she had walked from her ordinary, quiet life, and how quickly a single word from a stranger's child had changed the shape of her afternoon entirely. "Are you coming?" Ronan asked, tugging gently at her hand, his patience already thinning the way only a 3-year-old's could. She looked down at him, then up at Draven, who waited with an expression caught somewhere between hope and fear, and found herself nodding before she had fully decided to. "I suppose I am," she said quietly, and stepped through the gates. Behind her, the market noise faded into the distance, replaced by the rustle of old oak leaves, and the low murmur of guards speaking in tones too quiet to catch. Ahead of her, the house waited, and with it, though she could not yet know it, the beginning of a story far larger than any she had imagined when she woke that morning to cut flowers for the market stalls. The inside of the house was nothing like Alara had expected. She had imagined something cold and formal, the kind of grand hall that echoed with every footstep and made a visitor feel small. Instead, the entrance hall was warm with late-morning light, filled with the smell of wood smoke and something faintly herbal, like dried lavender tucked into old cupboards. A wide staircase curved upward at the far end, and portraits lined the walls, though she noticed with a small jolt that several of the painted faces bore the same sharp, watchful eyes as the guards who had escorted them. Ronan tugged her hand, pulling her toward a side room before anyone could stop him, chattering happily about a wooden horse he wanted to show her. The Draven allowed it for a moment, watching his son lead a stranger through his home with the easy confidence of a boy who had never once doubted he belonged wherever he stood. "He hasn't been this happy in a long time," Draven said quietly, more to himself than to her. Alara glanced at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "He seems like a sweet boy." "He is." Draven's jaw tightened slightly. "He also hasn't spoken more than a few words at a time to anyone outside the family since his mother passed. The healers said he might simply be shy. I wondered if it was something more." Before Alara could respond, a woman's voice cut through the hall, sharp and clipped. "Draven, a word, if you don't mind." An older woman stood at the top of the staircase, silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight knot, her expression carved from something far colder than curiosity. She descended the stairs slowly, her eyes fixed on Alara the entire way, as though measuring her for a coffin rather than a chair at the dinner table. "Morella," Draven said evenly. "This is Alara. She'll be staying for a short visit." "Will she?" Morella's gaze flicked to Ronan, still tugging Alara toward the side room, oblivious to the tension gathering behind him. "And does she know what she's walked into?" "Not yet," Draven admitted. Morella's mouth thinned into a hard line. "Then perhaps that conversation should happen before the whole pack starts drawing conclusions from a market scene half the town already witnessed." Alara looked between them, her earlier ease evaporating into something more cautious. "I don't mean to intrude," she said carefully. "If this is a bad time." "It is exactly the right time," Morella said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Better to have this conversation now, than after rumors take root among people who don't understand what they're seeing." Draven exhaled slowly, clearly bracing himself for a conversation he had hoped to have gently, in his own time, rather than under his aunt's sharp scrutiny. He gestured toward a nearby sitting room, its door propped open to reveal a modest table already set with a pot of tea, as though the household had known, somehow, that guests might need somewhere quiet to sit. "Ronan," Draven said gently, "why don't you show Alara your horse in a little while? I need to speak with her first." The boy's face fell, but he nodded with the resigned patience of a child who had learned that grown-up conversations sometimes came before playtime. He released Alara's hand reluctantly, hovering nearby instead of leaving entirely, settling onto a cushioned bench just outside the sitting room door where he could still see her through the gap. Alara took a seat across from Draven, her earlier curiosity now tangled with a growing unease. Morella remained standing near the window, arms folded, clearly intent on hearing every word. "I need you to understand something," Draven began, choosing his words slowly. "My family isn't like other families in this region. We come from an old line, one that carries certain traits. Strength beyond the ordinary, senses sharper than most, a connection to instinct that runs deeper than most people experience." Alara studied him, waiting for the explanation to resolve into something ordinary, some polite way of saying his family was simply wealthy and eccentric. It did not come. "Are you telling me you're werewolves?" she asked finally, half expecting him to laugh at the absurdity of the question. He did not laugh. "Yes," he said simply. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Alara heard her own heartbeat in her ears. She glanced toward the doorway, where Ronan sat swinging his small legs against the bench, humming quietly to himself, utterly unaware of the weight of the conversation happening a few feet away. "That's," she started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Impossible. Insane." And yet she thought of the guards' unnervingly still postures in the market, the way their eyes had seemed to catch light in a way human eyes did not, the low murmur of a language among them that had sounded almost like a growl smoothed into words. "I understand this is difficult to believe," Draven said gently. "I wouldn't blame you for wanting to leave and never think of this again, but I needed you to know the truth before anything else happened." "Before what happened exactly?" Alara asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Morella spoke before Draven could answer, her tone clipped and precise. "Among our people there is an old belief. Young pups, children, can sometimes sense a mate bond forming before the adults involved understand it themselves. It doesn't happen often. Most children grow up and never display the instinct at all, but when it happens, it is rarely wrong." Alara's gaze snapped to Draven. "You think your son believes I'm his mother because of some bond between us?" "I think," Draven said carefully, "that my son's instincts recognize something in you that mine are only now beginning to notice. I'm not asking you to accept anything today. I'm not even certain what to make of it myself. I only wanted you to have the truth, rather than stumbling through half-answers while my son continues attaching himself to your sleeve." Alara sat back, absorbing the sheer strangeness of the morning, waking to sell flowers, only to end it seated in a manor learning that werewolves existed, and that a toddler's instinct had apparently marked her as significant to a family she'd never met before that day. "This is a great deal to take in," she said finally. "I know," Draven said. "You're free to leave whenever you'd like. I'll have someone escort you back to town, and no one here will trouble you again if that's what you wish." Something in his voice, quiet and resigned, made her pause. He was not trying to convince her to stay. He was, if anything, bracing for her to go, the way a man braces for a blow he considers already earned. She glanced toward the doorway again. Ronan had abandoned his humming and was now watching her through the gap with wide, hopeful eyes, his small hands gripping the edge of the bench, as though he sensed the conversation might end with her walking away forever. "I'm not leaving in the next 5 minutes, if that's what you're worried about," Alara said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "But I would like some time to understand what exactly I've walked into, before anyone starts using words like mate bond around me again." Mirella's expression eased only slightly, though her arms remained crossed. "That is a reasonable request," she said, though her tone still carried caution. "I would ask only that she understand the seriousness of pack matters, Draven. This isn't a decision made lightly by our people, whatever her answer becomes." "I'm aware," Draven said quietly, his eyes never leaving Alara. "Believe me, I'm aware." A soft knock interrupted them. Gideon, standing in the doorway with an apologetic expression. "My apologies," he said, "but word from the market has already reached the lower town. People are asking questions about who was seen entering the estate grounds." Draven's jaw tightened. He had known rumors would spread quickly, but he had hoped for at least a few hours of quiet before the town's curiosity caught up to them. "Handle it as discreetly as possible," he said. "No details, simply that a guest was invited for tea." Gideon nodded and withdrew, though Alara noticed the brief, searching look he gave her before he left, the same wary curiosity she had seen in every guard's face since the market. She was beginning to understand that her arrival here was not a small thing to these people, whatever careful, gentle words Draven used to describe it. Ronan, apparently deciding that quiet grown-up conversations had gone on long enough, slipped off the bench and padded into the sitting room, climbing without hesitation into the empty seat beside Alara. He looked up at her with the open trust only small children seemed capable of, entirely unbothered by the tension humming beneath the adult's careful words. "Are you staying for lunch?" he asked, as though the entire fate of his family's future did not rest, at least in part, on her answer. Alara looked down at him, then at Draven, whose expression had softened at the sight of his son settling so easily beside her, and found herself smiling despite the overwhelming strangeness of the morning. "I suppose I could stay for lunch," she said, and the small, relieved breath Draven released told her more about how much that answer meant to him than any of Mirella's careful, guarded explanations ever could. Outside the sitting room window, the oak trees swayed gently in the midday breeze, indifferent to the quiet, careful hope now settling over the house for the first time in 3 long years. Lunch turned into something far longer and warmer than Alara had expected. She sat at a long table with Draven at one end and Ronan wedged happily beside her, chattering between bites about his wooden horse, about a dog in the garden that liked to chase birds, about 100 small things that seemed to matter enormously to him. Draven watched the two of them with quiet, careful attention, as though committing every small moment to memory in case it turned out to be fleeting. Mirella did not join them for lunch, choosing instead to retreat to some other part of the house, though Alara caught glimpses of other household members passing by the doorway, slowing their steps just enough to study her before continuing on. She understood, without needing to be told, that her presence had already become the subject of quiet, urgent conversation throughout the estate. "Everyone's staring," she said eventually, once Ronan had wandered off toward the garden with a maid trailing after him to keep watch. "They're curious," Draven said. "It isn't every day someone walks into this house and changes the mood of the entire pack within an hour." "I didn't do anything," Alara said. "Your son grabbed my dress. That's the whole of my part in this." "Perhaps," Draven allowed, though his tone suggested he did not entirely believe it. "But my people can sense things that aren't always obvious to the eye. Whatever brought Ronan to you wasn't nothing, and whatever kept me standing there instead of pulling him away wasn't nothing either." Alara turned her teacup slowly in her hands, considering how much of her own life to share in return for the strange honesty he kept offering her. "I should tell you," she said finally, "that I don't have any family left. My parents died when I was 16. A fire took our house one winter, and I was the only one who made it out. I've been on my own since then, mostly. Flowers seemed like a safe thing to build a life around. They don't ask questions. They don't leave, not really, not the way people do. Draven's expression shifted, something quiet and understanding passing over his face. I'm sorry, he said simply, without the awkward, overdone sympathy she usually received when she mentioned her past. It was a long time ago, she said. I've made peace with it, mostly, but I think that's part of why today felt so strange. I haven't had anyone reach for me the way your son did, not in a very long time. Draven was quiet for a moment, turning his own cup slowly. My wife's name was Ismay, he said eventually. She passed giving birth to Ronan. I've spent 3 years trying to be enough for him on my own, and some days I manage it, and other days I feel like I'm failing him in ways I can't even name. Watching him reach for you today was the first time in 3 years I've seen him look whole. Alara felt something tighten in her chest, some mixture of sympathy and an unfamiliar, cautious warmth she did not have a name for yet. That's a great deal of weight to place on someone you met an hour ago, she said gently. I'm not placing anything on you, Draven said. I'm only telling you the truth, because you deserve to understand why this house reacted the way it did. Whatever happens next is entirely your choice. Their conversation was interrupted by raised voices in the hallway, sharp enough to carry through the closed door. Draven's expression shifted instantly into something more guarded, and he rose from his seat just as the door opened to admit a tall, broad-shouldered man Alara had not yet met, his expression thunderous. Is it true? The man demanded, barely sparing Alara a glance before fixing his attention on Draven. The whole town is saying the Alpha brought a human woman into the house after his son called her mother in the middle of the market. Cassian, Draven said evenly, though a warning edge had crept into his voice. This isn't the time. With respect, Alpha, I think it's exactly the time, Cassian said. We have enough difficulty maintaining peace with the neighboring packs without adding rumors of the Ashwood heir being raised by an outsider with no pack ties at all. Alara sat very still, unsure whether to speak or remain silent while two men who clearly held some position of authority argued over her presence as though she were a problem to be solved, rather than a person in the room. She is a guest, Draven said, his voice dropping into something low and edged with warning. And you will speak of her with respect in my house, or you will not speak of her at all. Cassian's jaw tightened, but something in Draven's tone made him take half a step back, the posture of a man recalculating how far he was willing to push. I only mean to protect the pack's interests, he said, more carefully now. You know as well as I do how the elders will react to this. Ronan is your heir. If word spreads that his instincts have already marked a human before he's even old enough to understand what that means, word will spread regardless of what we do now, Draven cut in. The market was full of witnesses. I would rather the pack hear the truth from me than a dozen exaggerated versions from town gossip. Cassian's eyes flicked to Alara at last, studying her with open scrutiny, though not unkindly. No offense meant to you, he said stiffly. But you must understand how unusual this is. Our kind guards its bonds carefully. A human stranger walking into pack matters isn't something taken lightly. I understand you're worried, Alara said carefully, choosing her words with care. I don't fully understand what any of this means yet myself. I'm not here to cause trouble for anyone. Something in her steady, unbothered tone seemed to ease a little of the tension in Cassian's shoulders, though his expression remained wary. We'll see, he said, before excusing himself with a short nod toward Draven and leaving the room as abruptly as he'd entered. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Alara set down her teacup, suddenly aware of just how complicated her simple decision to stay for lunch had become. I think, she said slowly, that I understand now why your aunt looked at me the way she did. Cassian is protective of the pack's stability, Draven said, sitting back down, though the tension in his shoulders hadn't fully eased. He isn't wrong to be cautious. This situation is unusual, even by our standards. Do you think I should leave? Alara asked, watching him carefully. Draven hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might actually say yes, might decide the complications outweighed whatever quiet hope had been building in his chest since the market. Instead, he shook his head slowly. No, he said. I think you should stay long enough to decide for yourself what you want, without anyone else's fear or ambition deciding it for you. Ronan needs consistency more than he needs speed. If this bond is real, it will still be real in a week, or a month. There's no need to rush toward conclusions today. Alara considered his words, turning them over carefully. There was something reassuring in his patience, something that eased the instinctive wariness she'd carried since Cassian's sharp entrance. A week then. she said finally. I can manage a week away from my flower stall, I suppose, provided someone explains to my neighbors why I've suddenly disappeared. I'll see to it personally, Draven said, and for the first time since she'd met him, something like genuine relief crossed his face. Outside, the afternoon sun shifted lower over the hills, casting long shadows across the garden where Ronan's laughter still carried faintly through the open windows, blissfully unaware of the careful, uncertain negotiations happening on his behalf inside the house. Alara did not yet know how deeply this single decision to stay would reshape the rest of her life, nor how many more voices within the pack would rise in protest before the full truth of the bond revealed itself. But for now, sitting across from a quiet, grieving alpha and listening to his son's distant laughter drifting through the window, she found she was, against every reasonable instinct, glad she had stayed. The week Alara agreed to stay unraveled far differently than she expected. She had imagined quiet days spent mostly with Ronan, perhaps a few careful conversations with Draven, and a gentle return to her flower stall once the strange business of market rumors settled down. Instead, by the third morning, a formal summons arrived requesting her presence before the pack elders, a request delivered by Morella herself with an expression that made clear refusal was not truly an option. They wish to see you, Morella said, standing in the doorway of the small guest room Alara had been given, her arms folded in the same guarded posture she seemed to favor whenever discussing pack matters. Not to judge you precisely, but to understand what has happened and what it may mean going forward. That sounds exactly like judgment with extra steps, Alara said, though she rose from the chair by the window where she'd been watching Ronan chase a small dog across the garden below. Morella's mouth twitched, something almost like amusement flickering across her stern features. Perhaps, she admitted, but it is customary, and better handled with grace than resistance. The elders are not cruel people, whatever Cassian's temper might have suggested. They are simply careful. The elder council met in a long, high-ceilinged room at the back of the estate, its walls lined with old tapestries depicting wolves in various poses of hunting, guarding, and gathering, threads faded by decades of sunlight. 5 elders sat at a curved table, 3 men and 2 women, their expressions ranging from open curiosity to guarded suspicion. Draven stood near the head of the table, his posture rigid in a way Alara hadn't seen from him since the market. Please, sit, said the eldest of the group, a silver-haired woman named Perpetua whose gaze was sharp despite her evident age. We mean you no harm, child. We simply have questions, given the unusual nature of recent events. Alara took the offered seat, aware of every pair of eyes tracking her movements. I'll answer what I can, she said, keeping her voice steady despite the nerves tightening her stomach. Tell us, Perpetua said, in your own words, what happened in the market. Alara recounted the morning as plainly as she could. The flower stall, the small boy's sudden arrival, the word that had frozen an entire crowd of onlookers. She left nothing out, though she kept her tone measured, careful not to embellish or diminish anything that had happened. When she finished, one of the male elders, a broad man with a heavily lined face, leaned forward. And you felt nothing yourself? No pull, no recognition, before the boy spoke? Alara considered the question honestly. I don't know how to answer that, she admitted. I felt something when he looked at me, something I couldn't explain at the time. I assumed it was simple sympathy for a lost child. I didn't understand until later that it might have been something more. Bonds do not always announce themselves loudly to humans, Perpetua said, more to the table than to Alara directly. Sometimes they arrive as quiet certainty rather than sudden revelation. It would not be unusual for her to have felt something without immediately recognizing its meaning. With respect, said another elder, a woman with tightly braided gray hair, we cannot ignore the risks involved. A human bonded to the Alpha's line brings complications no amount of careful handling can fully erase. Rival packs will question our strength. Some may see it as weakness to be exploited. And some, Draven said, speaking for the first time since Alara had entered the room, may see it as proof that even after everything this pack has endured, we remain capable of building something worth protecting, rather than simply surviving out of fear of what others might think. The room fell quiet at his words, the elders exchanging glances that Alara couldn't fully interpret. Perpetua studied Draven for a long moment before turning her attention back to Alara. Do you wish to pursue this bond, child? She asked directly. Whatever it may become, no one here will force your hand, and no one will think less of you for choosing to walk away entirely. Alara hesitated, aware of Draven's careful stillness beside her, of the weight every person in the room placed on her answer. She thought of Ronan's small hand gripping hers without hesitation, of Draven's quiet honesty over tea, of the strange, unexpected warmth that had settled over her chest since stepping through the estate gates. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've only known this family for a few days. I don't think it would be fair to anyone, especially your alpha son, for me to make promises I'm not certain I can keep. But I don't wish to walk away either, not yet. I would like the chance to understand this properly, in my own time." Something in her honesty seemed to ease the tension gathering in the room. Perpetua nodded slowly, a faint approval crossing her weathered features. "A reasonable answer," she said. "Perhaps the wisest one available to her, given the circumstances." The braided-haired elder did not look entirely satisfied, but she offered no further protest, merely folding her hands and settling back into a watchful silence. The council dismissed Alara shortly after, though not before Perpetua caught her arm gently as she rose to leave. "Bonds like this are rare, child," the old woman said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that only Alara could hear. "Rarer still, when a young pup senses it before either adult involved. Whatever you decide, know that you are not merely a stranger who wandered into pack business. You are, in some sense, already part of its story." Alara left the council room with her thoughts tangled, walking slowly through the corridor until she found Ronan waiting outside, having apparently slipped away from his minder to sit patiently on the same bench he'd occupied days before. "Are you in trouble?" he asked, peering up at her with wide, concerned eyes. "No," she said, managing a small smile despite the weight still pressing on her chest. "Just a lot of very serious grown-up talking." "Boring," Ronan declared, in the flat, honest tone only small children could manage. And Alara found herself laughing for the first time since entering the council room, the sound surprising even herself with how genuine it felt. Draven emerged a few minutes later, his expression carefully neutral, though Alara could see the tension still lingering in his shoulders. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "I should have prepared you better for what the council would ask." "It's fine," Alara said, watching Ronan skip ahead of them toward the garden, apparently satisfied that the serious business of the day was finally concluded. "I think I understand a little better now what I've walked into." "And?" Draven asked carefully. "And I still don't know what I want," she admitted. "But I know I don't regret staying this long, complicated council meetings included." Draven's shoulders eased slightly at her answer, and together they followed Ronan into the garden, where the afternoon sun cast long, golden light over the hedges and the small dog Ronan had befriended barked happily at their approach. For a little while at least, the weight of pack politics and old traditions faded into the background, replaced by nothing more complicated than a child's laughter and the quiet, uncertain hope of two adults still learning how to trust something neither of them had expected to find. But not everyone within the estate watched the afternoon's peaceful scene with equal contentment. From an upper window, Cassian observed the small gathering below with narrowed eyes, his jaw tight with thoughts he had not yet dared voice aloud to anyone, thoughts that would, in time, prove far more dangerous to the fragile peace settling over the Ashwood household than any council's cautious questioning ever could. Cassian waited until the household settled into evening quiet, before seeking out the one person he trusted enough to share his concerns with fully. He found Morella in the small study she favored, surrounded by old ledgers and correspondence from neighboring packs, her reading glasses perched low on her nose as she worked through the evening's paperwork. She did not look up immediately when he entered, though her posture straightened slightly, a sign she had sensed his troubled mood before he'd spoken a single word. "You've been brooding since the council meeting," she said, finally setting down her quill. "Say what's on your mind, Cassian. I have no patience for circling conversations tonight." "You saw how the council responded to her," Cassian said, taking the seat across from her desk. Even Perpetua seemed half convinced already. If this bond solidifies, Ronan will grow up with a human mother figure at the heart of pack leadership. "Have you considered what that means for how other packs perceive us?" "I've considered it a great deal," Morella said evenly. "I raised the same concerns myself, if you recall, the very afternoon she arrived. And yet you seem far less alarmed now than you were then," Cassian pointed out. Morella removed her glasses, rubbing at the bridge of her nose with evident tiredness. "I've had time to think, and time to watch," she said. "Draven has been a shell of himself since Ismay died. 3 years, Cassian. 3 years of a man going through the motions of leadership and fatherhood, without ever truly living either role. I do not know yet whether this bond with Alara is destined to succeed, but I know that for the first time since his wife's death, I've seen something like hope in his eyes. That is not nothing. Hope does not protect us from rival packs looking for weakness," Cassian said. "You know as well as I do that the Larkspur pack has been testing our borders for months. If they learn our Alpha's heir has bonded with an unclaimed human woman with no pack ties, no lineage, no strength of her own, She is not without strength, Morella cut in, her tone sharpening. I've watched her these past days. She answered the council's questions with more composure than half our own young wolves manage under similar scrutiny. She did not flinch from difficult truths, and she did not make false promises simply to smooth over uncomfortable moments. That is its own kind of strength, whatever her lineage may lack. Cassian fell silent for a long moment, clearly turning the argument over in his mind, unconvinced but unwilling to press further against Morella's evident conviction. And if the Larkspur Pack uses this as an excuse to challenge our borders regardless? He asked finally. What then? Then we handle it the way we've handled every challenge before, Morella said, carefully, and together. Draven is not a foolish alpha, Cassian. He will not allow personal happiness to blind him to the Pack's genuine safety. Trust him to weigh both concerns properly, rather than assuming the worst before he's even been given the chance. Cassian rose from his seat, still visibly unsettled, though something in Morella's steady confidence had clearly softened his sharpest worries, if not erased them entirely. I hope you're right, he said quietly. For all our sakes. So do I, Morella admitted, once he'd gone, staring at the closed door for a long moment before returning her attention to the ledgers spread across her desk, her mind clearly far from the numbers in front of her. Unbeknownst to either of them, their conversation had been overheard by a third party, a young household attendant named Tomas, who had been sent to deliver a late tea tray and had lingered outside the study door longer than strictly necessary, drawn in by the tension in Cassian's raised voice. Tomas had no particular loyalty to either side of the argument, but he understood, with the sharp instinct of someone raised entirely within pack politics, that information about vulnerabilities in the Alpha's household carried value to certain interested parties beyond the estate's walls. He said nothing to anyone that night, delivering the tea tray as instructed and retreating to his own quarters without incident, but the seed of an idea, quiet and calculating, had already begun to take root in his mind, one that would, in the days ahead, prove far more consequential than either Cassian's cautious worry or Morella's careful reassurance. Elsewhere in the house, Ilara sat with Ronan in the small nursery adjoining his bedroom, reading aloud from a well-worn storybook about a fox who searched the forest for a family to call his own. Ronan listened with rapt attention, occasionally interrupting to ask questions about the fox's journey, his small hand resting comfortably against Ilara's arm as though he'd claimed his spot there permanently. Do you think the fox finds a family? He asked, midway through the story. I think he does eventually, Ilara said. Sometimes it just takes longer than we expect, and sometimes the family looks a little different than what we imagined at first. Ronan considered this with the serious concentration he seemed to bring to everything. Like you and me? He asked. Ilara's breath caught slightly at the simple, unguarded honesty of the question. Maybe a little like that, she admitted softly. Draven appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, having come to check on his son before retiring for the night, and paused at the sight of the two of them curled together over the storybook, Ronan's eyes growing heavy with the approach of sleep. He said nothing, unwilling to disturb the quiet moment, though Ilara caught his eye over Ronan's head and offered a small, tired smile. He should be asleep soon, she whispered. Thank you, Draven said quietly, stepping fully into the room now that the story had reached its natural pause. For staying, for all of this. I haven't done anything extraordinary, Ilara said. Just read a story to a tired little boy. You've done more than you realize, Draven said, settling into the chair on the opposite side of Ronan's bed. More than you can possibly understand yet. They sat together in comfortable silence until Ronan's breathing evened into the steady rhythm of sleep, the storybook slipping gently from Ilara's fingers onto the coverlet. Draven rose first, carefully tucking the blanket more securely around his son's shoulders, before gesturing for Ilara to follow him out into the hallway, where they could speak without risk of waking the boy. The council meeting troubled you, he said once they'd stepped into the quiet corridor. I could see it in your face afterward. It's a great deal to absorb, Ilara admitted, being discussed like a decision the pack needs to weigh carefully, rather than simply a person who happened to fall into your son's life. I know, Draven said. I wish I could tell you it gets simpler from here, but pack politics rarely simplify, even under the best circumstances. I don't need it to be simple, Ilara said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. I just need to understand what I'm agreeing to, if I decide to stay longer than a week. Draven studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. And what would help you understand that? He asked. Time, Ilara said simply. And honesty. As much of it as you're able to give me, even when it isn't easy to share. I can promise you that much, Draven said, and something in the quiet sincerity of his voice settled a measure of the uncertainty that had been building in her chest since the council meeting's careful, watchful questions. Neither of them noticed, as they said their goodnights and retreated to their separate quarters for the evening, the shadow of Tomas slipping quietly past the far end of the corridor, already turning over in his mind exactly which of the pack's rivals might pay handsomely for word of an Alpha's household distracted by matters of the heart. 3 days later, Tomas slipped away from the estate under the pretense of visiting family in the lower town, a route he had taken often enough that no one thought to question his absence. Instead of his family's cottage, he made his way to a quiet inn near the Eastern Road, where a man calling himself Aldrich waited at a corner table, nursing a drink he had barely touched. Aldrich was not a large man, nor an especially imposing one, but something in his stillness reminded Tomas uncomfortably of the Ashwood guards, the same watchful quality lurking just beneath an otherwise unremarkable exterior. "You said you had information," Aldrich said, without preamble, as Tomas took the seat across from him. "I do," Tomas said, lowering his voice despite the near-empty inn. "The Ashwood Alpha has taken in a human woman. His son called her mother in the middle of the market, in front of half the town. There's talk of a bond forming, real enough that the elders convened a formal council over it." Aldrich's expression did not change, though something behind his eyes sharpened with interest. "A human," he repeated slowly. "No pack lineage at all?" "None that anyone's mentioned," Tomas confirmed. "A flower seller from the border town. No family, no connections, nothing that would make her a strategic match by any measure." "And the Alpha allows this?" Aldrich asked. "He seems more than willing," Tomas said. "There's an internal disagreement about it, from what I've overheard. Some of the elders are cautious. One of the guard captains, Cassian, seems particularly concerned about how rival packs might interpret the situation." Something like satisfaction flickered across Aldrich's face, quickly smoothed away into careful neutrality. "You've done well bringing this to me," he said, sliding a small pouch of coin across the table. "Keep your ears open. If this bond continues developing, I want to know every detail. How the pack responds, how the Alpha's leadership is affected, anything that suggests weakness in their border defenses during this period of distraction." Tomas pocketed the coin without further comment, though a flicker of unease passed through him at the word weakness. He had told himself this was simple information trading, the kind of quiet arrangement that happened in every pack's shadows without ever amounting to anything truly dangerous. But something in Aldrich's careful, calculating tone made him wonder, for the first time, exactly what kind of plans his information might be feeding into. "The Larkspur pack has no quarrel with the Ashwood line that I'm aware of," Tomas said carefully, testing the waters. Aldrich's smile was thin and unreadable. "Every pack has an interest in understanding its neighbor's vulnerabilities," he said. "Whether that interest amounts to anything more than careful awareness depends entirely on circumstances yet to unfold. You needn't concern yourself with matters beyond your role here." Tomas left the inn with more coin in his pocket than he'd expected, and more unease in his chest than he cared to examine closely. He told himself as he made his way back toward the estate under the cover of early evening that he had done nothing more than share common gossip already spreading through the town regardless of his involvement. It was an easy enough lie to believe, at least for the moment. Back at the estate, unaware of the quiet transaction unfolding in a distant inn, Ilara spent the afternoon in the garden with Ronan, teaching him the names of the flowers growing along the estate's winding paths. He repeated each name with careful concentration, occasionally mangling the pronunciation in ways that made her laugh despite herself, his delight in her laughter only encouraging him to attempt increasingly complicated flower names, simply to hear the sound again. "That one," he said, pointing toward a cluster of deep purple blooms near the garden wall. "What's that one called?" "Larkspur," Ilara said, and something in Draven's expression, watching from a nearby bench, shifted almost imperceptibly at the word, though neither she nor Ronan noticed the brief flicker of old caution crossing his face. "Larkspur," Ronan repeated carefully, delighted with the shape of the word in his mouth. "Is it a happy flower or a sad flower?" "What an interesting question," Ilara said, considering it seriously for his benefit. "I think it depends on who's looking at it. Some people find it beautiful. Others might see it and think of things they'd rather not remember." She had no way of knowing how close her offhand answer came to the truth simmering just beneath the surface of pack politics, nor how soon the flower's namesake pack would come to matter far more directly to the fragile peace she'd found within these garden walls. Draven rose from the bench and joined them, crouching to examine the purple blooms alongside his son. "Your mother used to grow these," he said quietly to Ronan, an admission that seemed to surprise even himself once spoken aloud. "Just outside her window, if I remember correctly." Ronan looked between the flower and his father with evident curiosity. "Did she like them?" "She did," Draven said. She said they reminded her that even difficult, thorny things could grow into something beautiful, given enough patience and care. Ilara watched the quiet exchange with a tightness in her chest that had become increasingly familiar over the past several days. Not quite grief, not quite joy, but some complicated blend of both, born from witnessing a father slowly finding his way back toward memories he had long avoided, and a son beginning to understand pieces of a mother he had never truly known. "I think I'd like to plant some near my own window," Ilara said softly, testing the words as they left her mouth, uncertain what exactly she meant by them, or how permanent a claim they suggested. Draven's eyes met hers over Ronan's head, something quiet and hopeful passing between them that required no further explanation. "I think that could be arranged," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there during their earlier, more cautious conversations. The afternoon stretched on peacefully, the three of them moving slowly through the garden as Ronan continued his enthusiastic, mangled recitation of flower names, entirely unaware of the careful, dangerous currents beginning to stir beyond the estate's walls. Somewhere beyond the safety of the garden's high stone walls, information gathered from a household attendant's loose tongue was already making its way toward decisions that would, in time, test every fragile hope currently blooming within the Ashwood estate. But for now, in the golden light of a quiet afternoon, none of that danger had yet arrived, and Ilara allowed herself, for the first time since stepping through the estate gates nearly a week before, to imagine a future here that felt less like an uncertain visit, and more like the tentative, hopeful beginning of something she had never quite dared to want for herself. The message arrived on a gray morning nearly 2 weeks after Ilara's first visit to the estate, carried by a Larkspur courier who insisted on delivering it directly into Draven's hands. Draven read the letter twice before setting it down on his desk, his expression carefully controlled in the way Ilara had come to recognize, as his way of managing anger without letting it show fully on his face. Morella, summoned immediately, read the letter over his shoulder, her lips pressing into a thin line by the time she finished. "They're requesting a formal meeting," she said, under the guise of routine border discussions. "Under the guise," Draven repeated, his tone flat, "which means they've heard about Ilara, and they want to see for themselves what kind of distraction they're dealing with." "You think they mean to test us," Ilara said, standing near the doorway where she'd been waiting for news, Ronan's hand held loosely in her own after their morning walk through the garden. "I think it's likely," Draven admitted. "The Larkspur Alpha, Corin, has never needed much excuse to probe our borders. A perceived weakness, even an unproven one, would be more than enough incentive for a formal visit disguised as diplomacy." "What will you tell them?" Morella asked. Draven considered the question carefully before answering. "The truth," he said finally. "That my son formed a bond with a woman in the market, that the pack is still determining what that bond means, and that our borders remain exactly as well defended as they've always been, regardless of my personal circumstances. And if they push further than diplomatic questions?" Morella pressed. "Then we handle it the way we've always handled challenges to this pack's stability," Draven said, carefully, and united. Cassian arrived shortly after, having been summoned the moment word of the Larkspur letter reached the guard quarters. He read the message with visible tension, his earlier warnings about rival packs clearly weighing heavily on his mind now that they appeared to be materializing into genuine concern. "I warned you this might happen," he said, though there was no satisfaction in his voice, only weary concern. "You did," Draven acknowledged. "And I don't dismiss the danger, Cassian, but I won't let fear of rival packs dictate decisions about my own family. We'll meet with Corin as requested, present ourselves as the united, stable pack we are, and address whatever concerns he raises directly, rather than allowing rumor to answer questions we haven't been given the chance to address ourselves." The formal meeting was arranged for 3 days later, to be held at a neutral clearing along the border between Ashwood and Larkspur territory, a traditional site used for generations whenever the two packs required diplomatic discussion. Ilara, though not formally part of pack leadership, found herself included in the preparations, largely because Ronan flatly refused to be separated from her for the duration of the journey, throwing himself into such genuine distress at the suggestion that even Morella relented, deciding his composure mattered more for the visit's optics than strict tradition might otherwise dictate. The morning of the meeting arrived cool and overcast, a light mist clinging to the low hills as the Ashwood delegation made their way toward the border clearing. Draven rode at the front, flanked by Cassian and Gideon, with Morella close behind. Ilara traveled in a modest carriage with Ronan, who pressed his face against the window with wide-eyed curiosity at the unfamiliar landscape rolling past. The Larkspur delegation was already waiting when they arrived, arranged with deliberate formality along the clearing's edge. Corin, the Larkspur Alpha, was a tall man with sharp, assessing eyes and an easy, deceptively warm smile that did little to soften the calculating attention he immediately turned toward Alara and Ronan as they emerged from the carriage. "Draven," Corin said, extending a hand in greeting that carried just enough firmness to feel like a subtle test of strength rather than simple courtesy. "It's been too long." "Corin," Draven returned evenly, matching the handshake without hesitation. "I trust the journey wasn't too troublesome." "Not at all," Corin said, his gaze drifting deliberately toward Alara. "Though I confess, curiosity brought me here as much as routine border matters. The stories reaching my territory have been colorful, to say the least." "Stories often are," Draven said, his tone remaining carefully neutral. "I'd rather you judge the situation for yourself than rely on second-hand accounts." Corin's attention settled fully on Alara now, studying her with an intensity that made her chest tighten with wariness, though she held his gaze steadily, refusing to let her discomfort show. "And you would be the woman causing quite a stir among my neighbors," he said, his tone pleasant but pointed. "I would be Alara," she said simply, offering nothing further for him to work with. Corin's smile widened slightly, seemingly amused by her composure. "A flower seller, I understand. No pack lineage, no formal training in our ways. And yet the Ashwood heir apparently sensed something significant in you before either adult involved fully understood it themselves." He glanced toward Ronan, who peered out from behind Alara's skirt with open curiosity rather than fear. "Children's instincts are rarely wrong in my experience. Troublesome sometimes, but rarely wrong." "I appreciate your interest," Draven said, his tone carrying a subtle edge now, "but I believe we're here to discuss border matters, not to interrogate my personal affairs." "Of course," Corin said smoothly, though his eyes lingered a moment longer on Alara, before shifting fully back to Draven. "Though you must forgive my curiosity. A pack distracted by matters of the heart is, understandably, a pack other alphas take note of. I mean no offense by simply confirming the situation with my own eyes, rather than relying on market gossip." "And having confirmed it," Draven said evenly, "I trust we can proceed to the actual business of this meeting." Corin inclined his head, the diplomatic mask sliding smoothly back into place, though something calculating remained visible just beneath the surface of his easy smile. The formal discussion that followed covered routine border matters, hunting rights along the shared forest edge, a minor dispute over water access during the coming dry season, standard topics that required careful but ultimately unremarkable negotiation. But throughout the lengthy discussion, Alara remained acutely aware of Corin's occasional, assessing glances in her direction, and of the careful, controlled tension radiating from every member of the Ashwood delegation, none of whom fully relaxed until the meeting concluded and the Larkspur party finally began their departure back toward their own territory. "That went reasonably well," Morella said once the Larkspur delegation had disappeared from view, though her tone carried more caution than relief. "He got exactly what he came for," Cassian said grimly. "Confirmation that the situation is real, and a clear look at exactly how much it might be exploited if he chooses to. He also saw a pack that remained united and composed despite his provocations," Draven pointed out. "That matters more than you're giving it credit for, Cassian." Alara said nothing during the tense exchange, though a cold unease had settled into her chest since Corin's calculating gaze had first fallen on her and Ronan. She understood, more clearly now than during any of the council's earlier cautious questioning, exactly how much larger this situation had grown beyond a simple bond between herself and a grieving family. Whatever quiet, hopeful future she'd begun imagining in the estate garden now existed within a far more complicated, far more dangerous web of pack politics than she had fully appreciated until this very morning. As their carriage began the journey back toward the estate, Ronan curled sleepily against her side, exhausted from the long, tense day, and Alara found herself watching the passing hills with a new, careful wariness, wondering exactly what consequences Corin's calculating visit might set into motion in the days ahead. 10 days after the border meeting, Alara made the mistake of returning to town alone. She had told herself it was a simple errand. Her old flower stall needed tending, and she wanted to check on the small rented room she'd kept above the shop, still uncertain whether she was ready to fully abandon the independent life she'd built before a toddler's small hand had changed everything. Draven had offered an escort, as he always did now, but she had insisted on going alone, needing, if only for an afternoon, to feel like herself rather than a carefully guarded guest within someone else's household. The town looked the same as it always had, bustling and ordinary, though she noticed more curious glances following her than she remembered from before, whispers trailing in her wake as she made her way toward her old stall. She busied herself sorting through wilted stock and settling accounts with her landlord, allowing herself, for a few hours, the comfortable rhythm of a life she understood completely. She did not notice the man watching her from across the street until she'd nearly finished locking up the stall for the evening. He approached as she gathered the last of her things, his manner polite and unremarkable, the kind of stranger easily overlooked in a crowded market. "Miss Alara?" he said, and something about the careful, practiced way he said her name sent a small, instinctive chill down her spine, though she could not immediately place why. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral while quietly assessing the empty street behind him, noting how few people remained nearby as the evening light faded. "I've been sent with a message," the man said, "concerning the Ashwood family. It would be best discussed somewhere private." Every instinct Alara possessed, sharpened considerably over recent weeks spent among wolves who trusted such feelings implicitly, told her something about this encounter was deeply wrong. "I don't believe I caught your name," she said, taking a small, deliberate step back toward the lit doorway of a nearby shop still open for the evening. "That isn't important," the man said, his polite tone thinning slightly at her retreat. "What's important is that you come with me. Quietly, if possible." "I don't think I will," Alara said, her voice steadier than she felt, already calculating the distance to the nearest occupied building. The man's expression shifted, the pleasant mask slipping just enough to reveal something colder underneath. "This would go far easier for everyone involved if you cooperated," he said, reaching for her arm. Alara did not hesitate. She twisted away sharply, years of quick market instincts serving her well, and shouted for help with a volume that startled several nearby shopkeepers into immediate attention. The man lunged after her, but a burly baker emerging from his shop at the sound of her cry proved more than enough of a deterrent, planting himself firmly between them with the solid, immovable presence of a man who had spent decades hauling flour sacks. "Is there a problem here?" the baker demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The stranger's expression flickered with frustration, clearly recalculating his options against the growing attention his approach had attracted. Without another word, he turned and disappeared quickly into a side alley, moving with a speed that struck Alara, even in her panic, as distinctly unusual for an ordinary human pursuer. "Are you all right, miss?" the baker asked, turning his attention fully to her now, his earlier gruffness replaced with genuine concern. "I think so," Alara said, though her hands trembled as she gathered the last of her things. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come out when you did." Word reached the estate within the hour, carried by a messenger the baker had sent immediately once Alara, shaken but resolute, insisted on returning to the Ashwood household rather than remaining alone in town for the night. Draven met her at the gates himself, his expression carved from barely controlled alarm the moment he saw her pale, shaken face. "What happened?" he demanded, though his hands were already reaching to steady her, checking her over with the careful, urgent attention of a man assessing damage he desperately hoped hadn't occurred. "A man approached me," Alara said, her voice steadier now that the immediate danger had passed, though the memory still made her stomach twist uncomfortably. "He wanted me to go with him somewhere private. When I refused, he tried to grab my arm. A baker frightened him off before anything worse happened." Cassian, summoned immediately upon hearing the news, arrived within minutes, his expression darkening further with every detail Alara provided. "Describe him," he said urgently. Alara did her best, recalling the stranger's unremarkable features, his oddly formal phrasing, the unnatural speed of his retreat once the baker intervened. Cassian's jaw tightened as she spoke, clearly recognizing something in her description that troubled him deeply. "That sounds like one of Corin's men," he said finally. "I've encountered a few of his personal guard during previous border negotiations. The mannerisms match." "You think Corin sent someone to abduct her?" Draven asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I think," Cassian said carefully, "that Corin wanted to test exactly how much chaos he could create by removing her from the equation entirely, without directly declaring hostile intent against our pack. If she'd simply vanished from town, it would have been easy enough to claim ignorance, to suggest she'd simply left of her own accord, tired of pack complications." Alara felt a fresh wave of unease settle into her chest at the calculated cruelty of the theory, though she forced herself to remain composed, aware of Ronan hovering nearby, drawn by the commotion despite his nurse's attempts to keep him occupied elsewhere. "Mama?" the boy asked uncertainly, using the word with far more confidence now than he had during their first meeting weeks before, sensing without fully understanding that something had frightened the adults around him. Alara knelt immediately, pulling him into a steady embrace despite her own lingering fear. "I'm all right," she said softly, more for his comfort than her own reassurance. Just a little scare, nothing to worry about now. Draven watched the exchange with an expression that had hardened considerably since Alara's arrival, something protective and fierce settling over his features that made even Cassian take an involuntary step back. This changes things, Draven said quietly. Whatever caution I've shown Corrin until now ends immediately. If he believes he can threaten someone under my protection without consequence, he's sorely mistaken. What will you do? Morella asked, arriving just in time to catch the tail end of the conversation. I'll send formal word demanding an explanation, Draven said, and I'll ensure Alara and Ronan never leave this estate without proper protection again, regardless of anyone's preference for independence. Alara, still holding Ronan close, found herself nodding in agreement despite her earlier insistence on independence. The frightening encounter had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of the danger surrounding her new life, danger that extended far beyond simple pack politics, into something considerably more personal and immediate. That night, after Ronan had finally settled into an uneasy sleep, exhausted from the day's fright despite Alara's best efforts to soothe him, she found herself standing at her window, staring out at the dark hills beyond the estate walls, unable to fully shake the lingering unease the day's events had left behind. Draven found her there sometime later, his own expression tight with worry he'd clearly been suppressing since the moment he'd first seen her shaken and pale at the gates. I should have insisted on an escort, he said quietly, joining her at the window. I let you go because you asked for independence, and I nearly lost you because of it. You didn't nearly lose me, Alara said, though her voice wavered slightly on the words. I'm still here. Frightened, but here. I don't know what I would have done, Draven admitted, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to express so openly, if that man had succeeded in taking you from us today. Alara turned to look at him fully, seeing beneath his careful composure to the genuine fear still lingering in his eyes. Fear not just for pack stability or diplomatic complications, but for her specifically, for the life they had only just begun building together. I think, she said softly, that today made something clearer to me than all the council meetings and careful conversations combined. What's that? Draven asked. That I'm not simply visiting anymore, she said. Whatever this bond means, whatever complications it brings, I don't want to walk away from it. Not after today, not after everything. Draven's expression shifted into something raw and hopeful, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply standing together at the window, watching the dark hills where danger still lingered somewhere beyond the estate's careful protection, and finding, despite everything, a quiet strength in facing that danger together rather than apart. The formal letter Draven sent to Corrin the following morning left no room for polite ambiguity. He demanded a full explanation for the attempted abduction of a woman under his household's protection, and made clear, in language carefully measured but unmistakably firm, that any further threats against Alara or his son would be treated as a direct act of hostility against the Ashwood pack, with consequences to match. Cassian, reading over the letter before it was sent, nodded with grim approval. That should make our position clear enough, he said, though I doubt Corrin will admit fault outright. He won't need to admit anything, Draven said. He simply needs to understand that the cost of testing us again will be far higher than whatever advantage he hoped to gain. While the letter made its way toward Larkspur territory, a quieter investigation unfolded within the Ashwood estate itself. Gideon, tasked with identifying how information about Alara's presence might have reached Corrin's men with such specific detail, spent 2 days quietly questioning household staff, cross-referencing schedules, and observing behavior with the careful patience of a man who had tracked far more elusive prey during his years of service. It was Morella, ultimately, who noticed the small inconsistency that unraveled the mystery entirely, a discrepancy in Tomas's reported visits to his family in the lower town, visits that, upon careful checking, had not actually occurred nearly as often as claimed. When confronted directly, Tomas's composure crumbled within minutes, the full truth of his meetings with Aldrich spilling out in a rush of nervous, regretful explanation. I didn't think it would go this far, Tomas said miserably, standing before Draven and Morella in the same study where his betrayal had first been overheard weeks before. I only shared what people were already gossiping about in town. I didn't know they meant to hurt anyone. You knew enough, Morella said coldly, to understand that information about this household's vulnerabilities carried value to people with hostile intentions. Whether you fully anticipated the consequences or not, you chose coin over loyalty, and that choice nearly cost us dearly. Draven studied the young man for a long moment, weighing the appropriate response with the careful consideration such matters required. You'll be released from service immediately, he said finally. And you'll leave this territory entirely, since I doubt Corrin's people will consider you worth protecting once your usefulness has ended. Consider yourself fortunate that no lasting harm came from your carelessness. A different outcome would have demanded a very different response from me. Tomas left the estate that same afternoon, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by the shaken realization of exactly how close his casual indiscretion had come to genuine tragedy. Whatever fate awaited him beyond the estate's protection, it was, Draven reflected grimly, considerably more lenient than many alphas would have shown under similar circumstances. Corrin's response arrived 3 days later, carried by the same courier who had delivered the original border meeting request, though his tone this time carried none of the earlier calculated confidence. He denied any direct involvement in the attempted abduction, claiming the man responsible had acted entirely on his own initiative, motivated by ambitions of currying favor, rather than any formal order from Larkspur leadership. He offered, as a gesture of goodwill, to personally oversee the man's punishment and to strengthen formal assurances regarding border cooperation going forward. "Do you believe him?" Alara asked, once Draven had shared the letter's contents with her privately in his study. "Partially," Draven admitted. "I believe the specific man acted with some degree of personal ambition beyond simple orders, but I don't believe Corrin's hands are entirely clean in this matter either. He created the atmosphere that made such an attempt seem worthwhile, even if he didn't explicitly command it." "So what happens now?" Alara asked. "Now," Draven said, "we accept his gesture of goodwill publicly, while privately ensuring our borders remain considerably more vigilant than before. Trust, once damaged, requires careful rebuilding, regardless of how convincing an apology might sound." Alara nodded, understanding the careful, measured politics required to maintain peace between packs, without appearing either naively trusting or unnecessarily aggressive. She had learned a great deal in the weeks since that first startling word in the market, not just about wolves and bonds and ancient pack traditions, but about the careful, constant work required to protect a fragile peace against those who might seek to exploit any perceived weakness. That evening, as autumn settled fully over the estate grounds and the garden's larkspur blooms began fading with the changing season, Draven found Alara sitting quietly on the same bench where they had first discussed her decision to stay for lunch weeks before. Ronan slept peacefully in his nursery upstairs, finally free from the anxious clinginess that had followed the frightening market incident, having gradually regained his usual confident, curious nature as the days passed without further incident. "You've been quiet tonight," Draven observed, settling beside her. "I've been thinking," Alara said, "about how much has changed since that first morning in the market. I came here expecting to sell a basket of flowers and return home by evening. Instead, I found myself questioned by pack elders, nearly abducted by a rival pack's agent, and somehow, through all of that, more certain than ever that I want to stay." "Despite everything?" Draven asked quietly. "Because of everything, maybe," Alara said. "I've spent most of my life keeping myself carefully guarded, unwilling to risk attachment to people who might eventually leave, the way my parents did. But watching your son reach for me without hesitation, watching you fight so carefully to protect both of us despite everything pack politics demanded of you, I've realized something important." "What's that?" Draven asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That some things are worth the risk," Alara said, "even complicated, dangerous, unexpected things, especially those." Draven reached for her hand then, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt, after everything they'd endured together, entirely natural. "I never expected to feel this again," he admitted quietly. "Not after Ismay. I told myself I would simply focus on raising Ronan as best I could, and let whatever remained of my own heart stay quietly buried alongside her memory. And now?" Alara asked softly. "Now," Draven said, turning to meet her eyes fully in the fading evening light, "I find myself grateful, more than I can properly express, for a small boy's instinct that recognized something in you, before either of us fully understood it ourselves." They sat together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the garden, the season's final larkspur blooms swaying gently in the evening breeze, carrying with them the quiet promise of a bond that had weathered its first true test and emerged, against every calculated threat arrayed against it, stronger than before. Spring returned to the Ashwood estate nearly a year after Alara first stepped through its iron gates, and with it came a celebration the entire pack had waited a long time to witness. The garden had been transformed for the occasion, strings of soft lantern light woven through the old oak branches, tables arranged beneath blossoming trees and fresh flowers, grown from cuttings Alara herself had nurtured through the winter months, arranged in careful bouquets throughout the grounds. Pack members from every corner of Ashwood territory had gathered, along with a few cautious representatives from neighboring packs who had, over the preceding months, come to recognize the strength, rather than weakness, that had grown from Draven's bond with a woman once dismissed as an unremarkable outsider. Ronan, now 4 years old and considerably more confident than the small boy who had once clung uncertainly to a stranger's dress in a crowded market, ran through the garden in a formal little coat that he had already managed to muddy at the knees, utterly unconcerned with the dignity his father's advisors had hoped he might display for the occasion. "You look happy," Morella observed, finding Alara near the edge of the garden as the evening's formal ceremony approached. "I am happy," Alara said, smoothing the soft fabric of her own dress with hands that trembled slightly, though not from nerves alone. "I never imagined a year ago that my life would look anything like this." "None of us did, if I'm honest," Morella admitted, a rare warmth softening her usually stern features. "I doubted you a great deal in those early weeks. I want you to know that I recognize now how wrong my doubts were." "You were protecting your pack," Alara said. "I never held that against you, not truly." "Perhaps not," Morella said. "But I've watched you these past months. How patiently you've learned our ways. How fiercely you've protected Ronan. How steadily you've supported Draven through every difficult decision this bond required of him. Whatever doubts I carried when you first arrived, I carry none of them now." The ceremony itself was simple by pack tradition, a quiet exchange of vows before the assembled community, formalizing a bond that had, in truth, existed in every meaningful sense for months already. Draven spoke his vows with a steadiness that belied the emotion evident in his eyes, promising not just partnership and protection, but the kind of patient devotion that had slowly rebuilt a family broken by grief into something whole again. Alara, when her turn came, found the words arriving more easily than she'd expected, shaped by months of careful, honest conversation and the quiet, steady courage it had taken to build a life within a world so different from anything she'd known before. "I came to this family as a stranger," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed garden. "A little boy's instinct recognized something in me before I understood it myself. And in the year since, I've learned that family isn't only built through blood, but through the choices we make to stay, to fight for each other, and to trust even when trust feels frightening. I choose this family. I choose all of you, today and every day after." Ronan, seated on Morella's lap for the duration of the ceremony despite his evident restlessness, chose that exact moment to declare, with the blunt honesty only small children could manage, "I told you she was my mama," to the quiet, delighted laughter of the assembled crowd. As the formal ceremony concluded and the celebration shifted into an evening of music, food, and easy conversation among pack members who had, over the preceding months, gradually accepted Alara as fully belonging among them, Draven found a quiet moment to pull his new wife aside, away from the noise and warmth of the gathering. "Regrets?" he asked softly, watching her carefully in the lantern light. "None," Alara said immediately. "Not one. From that first moment in the market, to this exact night, I used to believe I would spend my life alone, tending flowers that asked nothing of me, because I was too afraid to risk anything that could truly hurt me if it left. Ronan changed that with a single word, and you've spent this entire year proving to me, patiently and honestly, that the risk was worth every uncertain, frightening moment along the way." Draven pulled her close, resting his forehead gently against hers. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying, for trusting us, even when trust asked more of you than it reasonably should have." "Thank your son," Alara said, smiling despite the emotion tightening her throat. "He's the one who started all of this." They looked together toward the garden, where Ronan had abandoned his formal coat entirely somewhere among the lantern-lit tables, and now ran barefoot through the grass with several other pack children, his laughter carrying bright and unguarded across the celebration, utterly transformed from the quiet, withdrawn boy who had spent 3 years grieving a mother he'd never truly known. The larkspur blooms Alara had planted the previous autumn had returned with the spring, clustering in soft purple patches along the garden's edges, thriving despite the season's earlier frost, exactly as Draven had once described his late wife believing they always would, proof that even the most thorny, uncertain beginnings could grow, given enough patience and care, into something genuinely beautiful. And as the lanterns burned low and the celebration gradually quieted into the peaceful hum of a pack finally, fully at rest, Alara understood completely that the ordinary market morning that had once seemed like nothing more than a strange, fleeting interruption to her quiet life had, in truth, been the beginning of exactly the family she never knew she'd been searching for all along.